All right, welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm excited you're here. It's going to be a really interesting session. Who's already been to an extracurricular session today? Awesome. All right, you're getting used to this speech. Well, I'm going to do it again. You can rate the performance this time versus the last time and let me know what your favorite was. So this is community content. It is curated by the community. We put up a forum, we collected proposals, we chose proposals, talked to people, interviewed people. There's a lot of time that went into preparing all this content for you that was put in by the community. This is not run by Salesforce. This is a special track. And what we're trying to do with it is take that hallway conversation that you have at a conference like this, sort of the accidental conversation with someone that's interesting, a peer of yours that's done something interesting you want to hear about, and they tell you a story, and you ask them questions, and they tell you more, and you ask them more questions, kind of explore this thing that they've done. So these are sort of dissections of technical problems, real-world challenges that people have overcome. And we're going to take this onion and put it in front of you, and we're just going to peel it back layer by layer by layer and just drill in deeper and deeper and deeper. And a key piece of this is it's long format. We have an hour and a half to do this. And it's conversational. It's really a dialogue between the audience and the people that are in the front here. So we've got a couple mics set up. We have some panelists that are going to help us have this conversation. So the bulk of this session is the Q&A. The Q&A is not an afterthought at the end where you can also ask some questions. The session is the Q&A. And all of the presentation leading up to that is just setting up the context for the conversation that we're about to have. So different format. Hope you really like it. We think that the format works really well and that you're going to come away with some really interesting knowledge. You hit a certain point where it becomes difficult to learn by reading books and reading blogs and looking at code. And you have to actually talk to somebody that's done it and ask them questions and help them sort of teach you in real time and clarify your thinking on something. It's a really good way to learn. It's a powerful way to learn. We're trying to distill that into actual sessions. Bit of an experiment, but so far so good. Okay, so my name's Chuck Liddell. I'm the CEO of an ISV that does integrations called Valence, and I was one of the organizers. Had a great organizing team, really appreciate their support, and we're very excited to bring you this talk. So before we start the main talk, we have this sort of weird little thing called quick talks. There's sort of a warm-up act for the headliner. So we're gonna have two quick talks here. They're 5-minute talks about some random thing. And I actually had people come in earlier today during a quick talk and think, I'm in the wrong room. This is not what I came in to listen to. So hopefully no one gets confused. Just two quick 5-minute talks with something cool, no Q&A, and then we'll get into the main session. All right? So without further ado, our first quick talk is, that's yours. Where's mine? Thank you. All right, our first quick talk is Michelle Hansen. Michelle Hansen is a 5-time certified accidental admin with NISC. Come on up, get set up. I'm covering you while you're getting put together. A software cooperative in the Midwest. Since transitioning to a full-time Salesforce admin in 2017, she has become a Lightning Champion, Trailhead Ranger, and co-leader of her local Trailblazer community group. She has been a repeat presenter on both the Automation Hour and Admin Hour webinars, in addition to presenting at DF 18 and Trailhead and Northeast Dream in 2018 and now Trailhead 2019. All right, give it up for Michelle. Take it away.
All right, well, since I'm supposed to be the opening act, we'll start with a joke. What did the developer name his firstborn son? Jason. Okay, so anyway, what I'm here to talk about in 5 minutes or less is how I overcame a problem with custom metadata and flow. I'm an admin. I cannot write code. I can barely read code to save my life. But this is a tool that I think you guys could probably also take and use as developers. Fabulous, it's up there. So basically, we're a software company. We do a lot of validation before we do a sale so their contracts are right. We ran into an issue where our sales team needed to get a lot of information and we needed to have our product team verify we could do it before we went to implementation. The same things need to be verified every time they're sold. So what we did is we started to create a custom object that we called SOS. Basically, they needed help validating things. Where we came into trouble is my sales team is not allowed to do the validation because they would just say, yeah, sure, it's validated, let's sell it, close the deal, move on. So how did we stop that? We needed other people to do the validation. So that was why I couldn't go just the declarative route of take a record and clone it. because you can't reset the values on that record back to kind of state 0. And so what I decided to do is I need the same record to be created every single time. So basically what I needed was a record template, and I didn't want a dummy company in my org with a dummy record because that just mucks up your data. So when I learned about custom metadata types, I went, wait a minute. I can pull all the information that I want into fields on a custom metadata record because it's something that I built myself. So what I did is for every single thing that we need to validate, I went and created a custom metadata record for it. So I'm just going to pull one up here, and let's say it's the additional environments. So if they want a test environment or they want a backup cloud environment, we have certain people in our tech team that they need to talk to. So I can go in here and I can assign it to a division. I can assign it to a certain type of opportunity. We deal with multiple different industries, and some have different requirements. I can put in my subject matter expert so that as those people change, it's just a record change. I don't have to go and change something hard-coded. And then I also have some other stuff in here, like the overview, that actually tells my salespeople what they need to do to mark this off as complete for contracts. Then what I did is I wrote a flow, and it's kind of big and looks super kind of ugly in New Flow Builder because I haven't optimized this, so I'm sorry. But basically what it does is from the opportunity, my sales team can go and figure out which of these records they need based on their deal. And it will go look up all the information in my custom metadata type. It actually looks at all of the SOS records on my opportunity to avoid creating duplicates. And then it will populate all of those record values for them with a click of a button. So as our requirements change, as our subject matter experts change, as anything else changes, I'm updating it in metadata records as opposed to having to go in and write yet another version of a flow or something like that. So what I thought I would do is just pull up an opportunity here, and I have a button. It's my SOS list. So if we click on this, it pulls up my flow. So I can go through and I can pick whichever ones I want. So for demo purposes today, I'm just going to go ahead and grab my additional environments one. It hits next. And basically everything's happening behind the scenes, and I've got quite a few things that are actually running to go ahead and do this. But if I now go over to my related list, I can see that the SOS has been created. It gives me the ability to control my naming conventions. And then all of the information in this record is at state 0. My status is identified. I have my subject matter expert, my description, and everything else is in here. So the sales team only has access to the fields that they need. The rest of the company can go in and update the fields that they are required to update to make sure that we've crossed all of our T's and dotted all of our I's. So there we go. Thanks, guys.
Kestrel is a certified system and application architect who leads technical services at Cloud for Good. He first encountered Salesforce as an accidental admin nearly 10 years ago, and now spends his days designing and building solutions to help nonprofits and educational institutions increase their impact. Take it away, Kestrel.
Thank you. So thank you all. As Chuck mentioned, my name's Kestrel Lowry, and I'm here to show you a fun solution for filtering and matching on probabilistically encrypted data using synthetic keys. So that's a lot of multi-syllable words. Let's back up and talk about the use case first. This was for a university hospital client that was receiving a flat file of clinical event information, so admissions, discharges, both inpatient and outpatient. In this flat file, they then needed to bring it into Salesforce for some other work that their team was doing, but the file might have had multiple rows for each individual clinical event. You might have one row with an admit date, a different row that'll list the same provider, same department, and it'll include the discharge date. We don't have an ID to match that up to the same event, but for the data to be useful in Salesforce, they needed to match it up. So we bring it into Salesforce on a staging object with a before insert trigger that's moving it where it needs to go for both the patient and the clinical event record. But we need to update a clinical event, and because HIPAA, we had to be encrypting just about everything on that object. We had to encrypt our admit date, our discharge date, the provider, the department of service, all of that's PHI. Now, what you may or may not know, depending on if you've poked around with shield encryption, is that there are two models. There's both deterministic encryption and probabilistic encryption. I'm not going to get too much into detail about that, but with probabilistic encryption, you actually cannot filter a query because your ciphertext is different for every value. We had to use probabilistic encryption because you cannot use deterministic on your date fields. So for an example here, I have my discharge date field is encrypted. If I try to run that query, I'm going to get an error. Executing my query here, failed to run. And if I look at the error, it says that I cannot run that query because discharge date cannot be filtered in a query call. So let's look at our field metadata. That is on our probabilistic encryption scheme. So how do we get around this? What we did is we generated a synthetic key, because once you query that data, you can return your probabilistically encrypted fields as part of your select statement. So you can get that into a map and use that to build a synthetic key off of those values that you can then use for matching within the class. So let's look at the code itself. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. This is a simplified version because client property. But what we essentially do when we're getting the flat file into our staging object, we're building a list of our contacts of anyone that is in those clinical events. We're then getting a list of, let's look at our clinical events in the org already that we have. We can't query for if the discharge date is blank or not, even though we know those are the ones we'd want to update. But we can at least filter for whether or not those contacts are in our list of contacts that we have. So you have to find something that you can use to trim your volume down with. We're working in a large data volume org here, so we had to limit it somehow so we didn't end up with a non-selective query. Once we get that list of clinical events, we're then able to build our key. So we look and make sure that we have values and everything that we're using for the key. I end up just setting the date to a day of year integer because the date was doing some weird things when you tried to use that as a key in the map. But composing the key then out of our different values that we actually want to use for matching because we don't have a unique ID. So we put our map together of this is everything that already exists in the instance for our clinical events that we know match a contact that we have on our file coming in. Next thing we do, we go through the things that are coming in for staging. So we build the same key format for every record that's coming in. And we look at our map and say, does this match? Do we have the record already? If we do, we take and we add it to our update list. If we don't, we take and we create the record, but we still put it back into that map because we may loop back to it later. We may have the row for that update later. So this supported us being able to do that filtering and matching while still keeping our data encrypted in a HIPAA-compliant fashion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kestrel. That was really cool. Okay, let me introduce your crew for the session. Our speaker is Matt Morris. Matt has been creating business software applications for the past 25 years. His first job saw him in a development team using only green screen terminals and where email was reserved for managers only. Ooh. Since that time, he has worked as part of teams delivering systems for mainframe, client server, the web, and since 2009 on the Salesforce platform. Matt's day job for the past 5 years is in the role of Salesforce architect, where he has worked with small business and global corporations to integrate Salesforce into their system landscape. He holds numerous Salesforce certifications, co-leads the London Salesforce Admins User Group with a lot of help from a fabulous team of people, and has been recognized as a Salesforce MVP since 2015. Okay.
Who wrote that?
So panelists today, we have Carl Brundage. Carl is a certified technical architect, Salesforce MVP, developer group leader, speaker, and blogger who was an early adopter of Einstein Analytics. Drawing on his experience working with hundreds of clients, he crafts technical architectures and custom apps that solve business challenges. Professionally, he holds 26 Salesforce certifications and is a Salesforce certified instructor for analytics. Now, what he didn't put in his bio, but I'm going to add, is that he was one of our speakers last year at the Extracurricular, and he did a great job. All right, second panelist today, Daniel Hosch. Daniel is the enterprise systems architect for Instructure, an education technology company that makes software that makes people smarter. Daniel has spent the last 10 years working in the Salesforce ecosystem as a customer. He holds 16 Salesforce certifications and is a Salesforce MVP Hall of Fame member. Now, does anybody see Daniel Peter in here? Daniel couldn't make it today, so I'm going to fill in moderating for Daniel. I'm Daniel Peter, and I'm incredibly smart, and I speak slowly, and you have to listen to my words very carefully because each word has much impact.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what
How many
it's like.
certifications has he got?
He's got loads. So I guess I'll just introduce myself. I'm Chuck Liddell, Salesforce MVP. I'm a co-user group leader in Hawaii. I have 20 Salesforce certifications, and I helped organize this event. So it's a little weird for me to be up here, but I'm going to fill in. So just to set context here, this is sort of moving into the main session we're going to have. Matt's going to do about 20, 25 minutes of setup for this conversation. We're going to sort of get the context and sort of start working our way through this layers of an onion. And then we're going to go into some Q&A. We'll do panelists first, kind of to warm up. The panelist's job here is not to answer questions so much as it is to ask questions they think you'd like to hear the answer to. They're your proxy, because you might not think right away of all the interesting questions that could be asked, and they're here to kind of get things warmed up. But as you start to, your brain juice is going, and you have your own questions, hop up on a mic, and we'll kind of jump around the room and ask questions. Feel free to answer questions, add color commentary, and especially kind of as Matt's talking, maybe take some notes on questions you'd like to ask, because it'll be some time before we can kind of come back around to all the different questions that'll come up. Okay? So let's get started. Take it away, Matt.
All right. Wow, where do we begin? Okay, so what I'm about to show you comes from some project experience I had where we had a lot of data. We had a lot of data we had to, in theory, bring into a place that the users of Salesforce could see it. And I'm couching it that way because that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to put it on Salesforce. So that's where we're going to get to. I want to start by drawing you a picture because there's quite a lot of moving parts here. And in preparing with Chuck, we try to strip it back so that it's digestible and frames the conversation. So I like drawing pictures. So we've got our data management landscape. And we start really with these legacy systems. So what are these legacy systems? This was really case management systems, email management systems. So if you've ever been in a place where there's lots of inbound emails come in, and it's somebody's job to once a day go through and answer all these things, it was one of those systems. And basically the environment was pretty ungoverned. It had grown organically over a few years. So we had a lot of systems. Some of them were pretty rubbish. And some of them were SaaS systems as well, and the CTO decided he was going to pull the plug on those contracts as well, so the clock's ticking. So we've got to do something with this data. That's the issue. So we're going to need an ETL process of some kind to extract that data, but where are we going to put it, right? So over on the left-hand side, we've got our decommissioning systems, the one we want to get rid of, and then in the middle, we've got our operational systems. But before I get to that, how much data are we talking about?
Could you speak up a little?
Can I speak up a little bit?
Louder.
Not loud enough? Can you hear me now?
Just be loud.
I can't be loud. I'm British. So how's that?
Better.
So how much data were we talking about? So one of the exercises we did was to go through the legacy systems that we had. That was about 10 million rows, and some of the data was not good. It was pretty poor quality, so that was something we had to deal with. But we're going to have our future system, which is going to be Salesforce, and we're going to use Salesforce email to case. That itself generates a lot of data. So we did a calculation around that, and we had to do a calculation not just for year one. We had a 7-year retention requirement on this data. So anybody who's a customer, even if they cancel, we still need to keep that data for 7 years because we had a commercial relationship with them, and that includes any emails that were involved. So where did that leave us? Well, each year we were generating about 6 million rows of data inside Salesforce around accounts, cases, and emails predominantly. And if we extrapolate that out, we had a lot of churn with the accounts. So this was kind of a sort of a subscription business where people could sign up for a trial and then cancel before they had to pay, and then they would sign up again later. And if they used a different email address, it's a different account. So we had a lot of churn with that data as well. So that meant that at the end of year 7, we were expecting we would have produced 14 million account records, which is just nuts. And then for cases, probably 5 million, 19 million rows of email. It's just a huge number. And if you compare that against what we had available, it's always nice when you do a hypothetical scenario, money's no object. But in the real world, we had about 600 odd EE licenses, which gave us about capacity for just over 9 million rows. And I'm only talking about our email case management here, right? We haven't even got into our sales and marketing requirements. So, it's clear that this is just a non-starter. So we did this exercise so that everybody understood that we had a problem that we needed to deal with. And of course, we're in the UK, we're in the EU, so GDPR was also a requirement. So GDPR now puts a lot of restrictions around as controllers and processors of data, we now have more responsibility. Back in the day, we didn't used to worry about having to dispose of data when we were done with it. We just leave it in the database. It was a SQL database. We can't do that anymore. It's really the first project that I'd worked on under the new regime of GDPR. And in my intro, I've been doing this for a long time, right? 25 years. And I'll put my hand up. We probably played fast and loose with data. And now I think the degree of scrutiny has kind of gone way up. So I was looking at it through different eyes. So data. ETL process, and then where are we going to put it? Well, some of it's going to go to Salesforce, and then some of it's going to go into a as yet unspecified data archive. So this is where I'm starting to think, okay, where could we put this, right? So we're going to put it in some kind of a SQL database. Is that going to be SQL Server? Is that going to be something on AWS? Is that going to be Heroku? I mean, it could be anything, right? Or, could we put that on platform? Is there something we could use like big objects? So my colleague suggested, hey, maybe this is a opportunity to use big objects. And does everybody remember when big objects came out? It was kind of like, I'm not sure what I can use that for. So I initially kind of went, I'm not sure that's going to really solve our problem. I subsequently went and investigated it, so I will show you that because I learned quite a lot about that. So opportunity to put some stuff on Salesforce, we can put the rest of the stuff in our data archive, but as well, we've got to extract from Salesforce and archive that data, right? Because remember, I'm talking about those cases and emails, again, generated from an email to case. An email to case is nasty, right? Somebody sends in an email, that generates a case and an email. We then send an auto response of some description, that generates another email. They might then reply to that generates another one, and then we get another email. So typically you're ending up with about 5 records for every interaction that you're going to have. So we needed to pull that out as well. And then I try to trim this down as much as possible, but we don't work in isolation, right? It's not like you can put everything on Salesforce and Salesforce does all your processing. There are other systems involved. So we had the ERP system, and the ERP system actually held the customer master, right? Customer master wasn't in Salesforce, and that ended up being quite key to the strategy that we adopted at the end, because if the customer master is in the ERP system, maybe I don't need to keep it in Salesforce all of the time. And then this is really what I was most interested in. I think ETL problems, integration problems, we know how to solve them for the most part, right? It's a lot of coding and use of APIs, blah blah blah. What about the user experience? This is what I was really interested in, is how could I produce for the users some kind of a seamless experience so that they wouldn't realize where the data was coming from? Why should they have to care whether the data is in an archive, whether it's in a big object, whether it's in a standard object? They shouldn't really have to care. So we've got our customers feeding their emails in. That's coming in Salesforce email to case, and then we've got our service agent. So they need to a view of data from the CRM and the archive system. And then we had data stewards. So data steward, I think, is going to be one of these roles I think we're just going to start seeing more of, because these are the people who are responsible for the GDPR compliance, right? So when you get a subject access request, somebody wants to know how much data you're holding about them, that's now going into somebody who is in that role of a data steward, even if it's not in their job title. Likewise, things about data quality as well. So we had the need for that person or that role to be able to view the data in Salesforce, so they need access to Salesforce. We also needed them to have access to data that was in the archive. And then additionally to that, they had their own tools that they could use as well. So that's kind of the picture of the landscape. We've got our users over on the right-hand side. That's how they're interacting with those systems in the middle. And what I wanted to produce for them is is an experience where they see in the data, they don't really have to care where it comes from. So how do we do that? So I tried a few different things. And in the final solution, we actually ended up adopting a hybrid combination of these. So our service agents and our data stewards are going to access Salesforce through their web browser. And I'm calling that out specifically because I think one of the things that I've learned in the last couple of years is that your browser isn't just a portal into whatever system you're looking at, right? It's an active participant, right? Single sign-on wouldn't work without the web browser actually running some JavaScript to make things happen. Likewise with screen mashups, right? So we can surface data from two different systems, but from a user's point of view, it's seamless, right? So the browser, for me, is a much more active participant in an overall solution than just, this piece of glass. In order to keep it seamless, whatever the data archive solution was, I wanted to have single sign-on. So I wanted somebody to be able to use their Salesforce login in order to access that system. So how do we do that? That could be a good question. And what's more, I wanted it to be viewed within Lightning Experience, right? So I had an idea I wanted to surface this stuff as components. So that was sort of the presentation. And then in terms of the storage, well, we've got the data archive, so that's going to be some kind of SQL database and a web application. And what I went on to experiment was, could I make a web application look like Salesforce, right? Could I use the Lightning design system so that it would appear seamless to the user? And then we've got the big objects on platform. So we'll take a look at the config of the big objects, and then what do you get with a big object in terms of being able to configure it, being able to display and update data with it, and what do you have to build yourself? Hint, you have to build it all yourself. And then the last thing was, I really was very interested in kind of the use of a mashup. So I spoke about mashups a couple of minutes ago. I wanted to see whether or not Canvas would work well inside Lightning Experience. So does anybody remember Canvas when it came out a few years ago? Sweet, you did the hands up thing. So I checked you're still awake. So Canvas basically is a secure iframe. And from what I had a hunch was that it was going to satisfy a couple of the requirements that I had. It's a secure iframe because it takes care of the authentication. So it makes sure that the user is able to access Salesforce and therefore, they're allowed to see whatever the remote web application is. But it also allows secure messaging between Salesforce and the remote application and vice versa. And I wondered whether or not I could use that as part of my solution as well. So that's what I ended up building. We had this archive-related list component, which was a Canvas app. We needed a legacy data viewer, which is basically all of that crap that we didn't really want to load into Salesforce and we weren't really going to be able to match. That was just going to be surfaced within a Salesforce page. And then for the big objects, we needed a component that was able to display that big object. So I just stuck these in because I didn't want to start navigating around Salesforce. We'll get into Salesforce in a sec. So my big object related list component is really just the same as you would if build a custom component. You use Lightning Design System. You get some markup on there. The Lightning Design System website's pretty good these days for giving you the starter on that. And then behind that, it's just a standard Apex class that runs a query against the big object. Now, the Canvas one was a bit more interesting. So there's a standard component from Salesforce called force::canvas app, and this is basically your ability to put a secure iframe inside whatever it is that you're doing. And you get to specify some parameters with that, right? So one of those is, what are the input parameters that you want to pass as you fire it up? So in our example, that's going to be the parent record. So if I want to go and have my email messages surfaced from the remote system, I want to pass it the case that's the parent. And then there's this other thing as well, which is you can say, when we successfully load that iframe, so when within Salesforce it's successfully managed to load the remote web page, you can specify an event that you want it to fire. And that's really critical because it's at that point you can then, and I had to Google this endlessly to try and find the one article that talks about how to do this. You can add a listener. The documentation's not good. You have the ability basically to add a listener in order to then listen for the event that's going to get sent. Now we're getting a bit dense. So I think the best thing is, let me show you in action. Back to you, Mark. Sorry. I use humor as a stress buster. So here we are in Salesforce. So what does that look like? Let's do, put my glasses on. So what I did is I basically built out in a developer org, and this is what we're looking at. We then went on to give it to some proper developers to write. So any of the
Can you make it a little bigger?
Huh?
Can you make it a little bigger?
I can make it a little bigger. Any of the code you see, just remember I'm not a developer. Can you see that all right? Say, yes, Matt, or no, Matt. Yeah? Okay. So I basically built it out. And this is one of the nicest things about my job as an architect, which is there's no substitute for actually going and trying to figure out, actually, how's that going to work? Let's try it out. So I had some fun with this. So what I did is we built or I prototyped up the archive viewer. And then there was a little side note. I tried various different ways to display that in Salesforce. So, for example, you could put it on a web tab. That's not very nice, is it? I don't really want my users seeing that, even if they can say it. They don't want to see don't want to see it next time. So maybe web tabs a little bit too out of date. It's going to load, but it will load. There we go. So I also tried it with a Lightning page. Yeah, that was a little bit better, but it's a little bit rough around the edges. Good old-fashioned visual force to the rescue. This was the one I was happy with, because I kind of wanted that seamless experience. So what happened there when I loaded that was that it requested from the remote application to load the page. But did you see the extracting token, that little bit of text flash up? That's because I'm using Salesforce as my identity provider. So what happened behind the scenes is an OAuth flow took place. Now, I didn't have to put my credentials in because I'm already logged in. So that was giving me the seamless outcome that I wanted. If I went and just put the URL of the remote application in another browser without a session established, it would ask me to log into Salesforce. Okay.
What method did you use to make your Visualforce page look like Lightning?
That's using the Lightning. So this Visualforce page just has an iframe on it, and then everything that's inside that is from what I prototyped on a Heroku Node.js Express Lightning design system. So it just looks like Salesforce. That was my goal.
Is that Lightning out or just styled?
That's just styled. Yeah, and we can go look at that. Let me show you a couple of other things. Keep the questions coming, guys. It's easier. So what about, okay, so that's the kind of the standalone app. So we got a load of data. We're not even going to try and match it and bring it in. We just need to give them access to it because the alternative was they were just going to go and search in the Gmail client, and that was a big compliance issue. So that was that one pretty much solved. Now, from a archive point of view, from a, archiving and redisplaying of our data that we're going to be building up through web to case. So I tried it with a big object, and that was relatively straightforward. So I'm looking at a case here, and what's going to happen is this related list here is not a related list. It's a component that I wrote that just runs that query over the big object in order to bring the fields back. So that was the code I was showing just before we went in there.
Are you working synchronously or asynchronously with that big object?
That's a very good question. You want me to take that one now?
If you're covering it
Okay,
later,
so
that's fine too.
let's go into the big objects. So the reason I guffawed at my colleague when he said let's use big objects is it looked like a lot of work from what I remembered when big objects were released, right? You had to kind of, run this asynchronous query and rehydrate the big object into some kind of a custom object. I'm like, why would I want to do that? Turns out you don't need to do that. Turns out you can run a SOQL query directly on a big object, but there's a few conditions, right? Let's have a look at those. So here's the big object definition. And in the prototype here, I've just got the email message archive. So if we take a look at it, it's very much like when you define a custom object, except it's not as flexible as a custom object. That's kind of restriction number one. Now, I could live with this, but it's less than ideal. You get a lot less field types in a big object than you do in a custom object, right? You do get a lookup, so that meant I could always relate it back to my parent object. And I was adopting this sort of approach of, well, the parent object is going to be on Salesforce, and then what I'm going to do is it's going to be in the standard object, and then I'm going to use the big object as kind of my back-in store. So if it's if it's an email, the case will be in the case thing. If we were to archive both the case and the email, the account would be there. We would go with that. But other than that, you just get some very basic types. So that was kind of issue number one. But then in terms of how do we query it, so when you define your big object, it doesn't have an ID the same as a custom object would. And if we were to go and query the data in this big object, there is an ID field, right? But it's just got the same value in it the whole time. They don't populate it. What you have to do is you have to define an index, right? So what a big object is really is it's just an abstraction over a web service that's talking to some other object database, some other store that Salesforce have got somewhere else in their infrastructure. And what they've done is they've put a nice wrapper over it for us to use. But one of the caveats is you have to define what that index is. The index has to result in a unique field. How did I solve that? Well, that was easy. I just used the original Salesforce object ID because they're always going to be unique. So that's solved for number one. But you have to then sequence your keys in order of precedence and then use them with the most significant first. So you can leave off the minor keys, but you can't mix and match. You can't create a query which is not following the order of precedence. So that was really, to answer your question, Carl, no, you didn't have to use async, but you only get to query the data pretty much one way, right? So you can't, kind of have one big object with all your data in and then, query it by email address one time and query it by last received date another time. But for my needs, that was okay because I was really just looking to produce a related list for my end users. We didn't want reports. We didn't have any need to kind of do any big processing over it.
So why descending on both of your index keys?
I'm trying to think if that's a conscious choice. I think what I was trying to do is just kind of I think that's the default.
Most recent to the top?
I think so, yeah. I can't remember if during the prototyping as well, I was trying to include date in there and it wasn't working, but I was just basically trying to show the most recent. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything with the big objects. It's fairly straightforward. So, would I be tempted to use this in different use cases? Yeah, I think I would consider it. You've got to build the code. You've got to build the component to display it. But for the most part, it's free storage. Caveat.
That's a question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the data is more than 1 million records, right?
Yeah.
More than 1 million, but the part, remember, by default, it is 1 million for free.
On big objects?
Then you need to pay.
Yeah.
Did you pay that?
No. So here's the other interesting thing, which is
So
Okay, sorry,
you made
yeah.
a statement that you get 1 million rows for free.
Yeah.
And then asked Matt if he paid for more than that.
right. So sorry. So yeah, you get 1 million big object rows for free, right? If you go read the documentation, it says they don't monitor that limit. Now that might change, so we'll put a safe harbor on it. So no, we don't actually need to buy anything. I think this is kind of, so at the moment, they're trying to get people to use big objects, I think.
There's like some
They wait till you have 100 million rows, then they
Well,
come back in.
yeah, and then, then your account executive is going to want to have a conversation because there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, because you're stuck.
Do you want to jump up on that, Mike?
Did you consider the use of external objects for some of the remote access?
So, external objects, Salesforce Connect would solve all of these problems. Okay. Right? And that's Salesforce's answer for off-platform, right? So it's a nice solution. I've been a big fan for a long time. I think it's economically viable when you make Salesforce Connect be part of your overall infrastructure, your overall integration architecture. We chose, for a number of reasons, to have a custom integration architecture because we had a number of legacy systems that kind of needed to be retired over time. So it wasn't really economically viable. We had a few other pressures on the projects, kind of financially and also around procurement. The procurement life cycle was pretty long. So there was lots of reasons that wasn't an option for us. And we just had this one immediate requirement, right? Because systems were being sunset, within a couple of months. So yeah, absolutely, Connect solves this. But if you can't do Connect, what can you do? That's kind of where this exercise took me.
So yeah, Matt, on the economic part of that, is that because you had multiple endpoints? I mean, that's really like pricing on Connect is by like the endpoints you want to hit to.
Yeah.
So you were like, we got to go to 20 endpoints or whatever, so then it was going to be really expensive. Is that kind of where you're saying, or?
So when it was kind of a sledgehammer to crack a nut because the rest of our integration, just pop this back up. Where can we go? Can we go this one? Yeah, so the rest of our integration was really on this kind of hybrid ESB master data management, data integration that we needed to put together, right? It was really sort of a mixture of different technologies to solve our problems. That's where we were putting our effort in terms of integration. This is actually really a fairly small requirement in the big scope of the project, right? People are like, right, we want to rationalize our legacy case management and email systems. You can take care of that, right? We're like, So yeah, we were just kind of looking for just a fairly low drama way of solving this without upending the rest of the architecture. I think on the price point, I mean, my rule of thumb is that one Connect endpoint costs you about the same as a web developer every year, but then you're paying that every year. So it's, again, I think it's kind of how central is Connect to what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you get other things with with it as an external object. Like, so one of my questions I was going to ask you later, I'll ask now, is kind of the discoverability of this data. So like, searching it, for example.
Yep.
It looks like the way that you've got it configured is that if you're like, oh, I need to search cases, I didn't find it. Let me go look in the archive section. Oh, is it there? Like, so you don't have a place to just a single spot to say search for a particular thing.
Right, and again, with sort of taking the hierarchical approach, the way it worked for service agencies, they would locate the customer, based on their details on their account/contacts, right? That's how we would do it, and then that's the agent's entry point into, okay, what's the case history? What's the email thread? And 99 times out of 1,000, or 99 times out of 100, they didn't need to access this data. I mean, it just needs to be there for that time when you've got a problem customer that you need to go back and look at the email chain. That was really kind of the use cases that came out of the business analysis. In terms of reporting, that's all done. The data's still live in the system. Yeah, we'll pull off the summary reports, and then we've got the data that we need. And then don't forget as well, the GDPR aspect is we want to try and get rid of it as soon as we can get rid of it. And we were challenging the 7-year retention as well because it's a big burden to carry.
Keep going.
Thanks. Oh, pick up the pace?
No, get back to your core stuff. I know you have a few more things you want to show.
Yeah, so funnily enough, big objects was kind of like the simple one. Wait till you see this other stuff. So how did that work? So that's big objects. And you can have some more questions on that in a minute if you want. So what about the other stuff? So this canvas-related list idea. I thought I was pretty clever. That's really what this is. I'm stood up here going, I was really clever. You may disagree with me. So how did that work? So I learned an awful lot here, actually. This was really nice. And if I'd been a better developer, I would have put a little holding thing here. So this web page is being served from what is Heroku app server, right? It's styled with Lightning Design System, and it's iframed in using Canvas. Canvas uses a secure signed request. We can have a look at that, but basically what it's got inside it is all of the details about the user who's made that request. It gives them an OAuth token, so that remote system now has authenticated access to come back into Salesforce server to server if it wants. And it's not a lot of effort. It's certainly a lot less effort than writing an OAuth flow, which is what I had to do for the full page app. So I'm like, why would I just not use Canvas as my iframe wherever I need an iframe? Why would you have unsecure iframes? But this was where I had the most fun. This was with the event thing. This is where I think I'm really clever. You may disagree. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to allow people to be able to display the email message when, if they wanted to look at it. Now, I thought I could do that with a little overlay, a little pop-up modal. That would be a nice, easy way. We didn't have to navigate anywhere. But if I put that inside the iframe, the modal can't be any bigger than the iframe, right? I'm really clever. So what's happening here is because we're using Canvas, because we can have that secure messaging in the browser, right? Don't forget, the browser is so important here. What's happening is the web page that's on the browser that's been served from the Heroku app has got the record basically behind the button, because I'm a lazy coder, but you could do it in a more elegant way. When I click the link, it's going to send that payload through that iframe to the iframe that's in Salesforce, and then that listener that I showed you, that's going to pick that up, and then I've got my data, and then this overlay here is actually a Lightning component that's local on Salesforce. So the way I think about it, it's kind of like in the movie Interstellar, where Matthew McConaughey's coming back through the wormhole, and he's waving at Anne Hathaway, because they love each other. But just imagine him not waving at her. Instead, he's carrying that email message, and he's bringing it back to you in order that you can display it. So, this was really a journey of discovery for me. I think I'm funny. But this really was a journey of discovery for me. What did I learn? I'm like, why would you ever have an insecure iframe when you can set up this thing? And then, well, hang on, we can event. So it's like, it doesn't even matter where systems, where pages are served from, really. Right? I think there's a few more things that you could use this for.
So you're using that Canvas app as a widget in a larger page that's essentially proxying various communications with the external server and even triggering other actions on its siblings and in the hierarchy somewhere else in the page.
Yeah. So if we look at it, so I showed you. So there's the definition of the component, and what I was pointing out in the slide is that we've got this property here, which is on Canvas subscribed. You give it the name of a method to run, and then there's our Canvas subscribed event, and then what that does is it adds just a standard event listener that you would have in any kind of web application. And I was looking through the documentation because I thought the Canvas API must have something to support this, but no, actually at this point, you're basically, kind of native, I guess, however you want to say it. And yeah, once that event is fired, then you get to do the whole, modal overlay thing. How does that work? So this is actually this component is really just the Canvas component. It lives in a slightly larger component, if you will, which is the overlay library, and then the Canvas viewer component that we were just looking at. So that's how those two things get to work together.
Repeat the question.
Does the Canvas or does the event listener need to wait for the Canvas app to be subscribed, or can it just be set up on the init method of the OR component?
It could probably be set up on the init, but as I was going through this, I thought, well, that's, why is that there? That's there to say, yep, it didn't barf on us, so let's go ahead and do what we want to do. There is another gotcha in here, which I found on a previous project, much to my embarrassment, is this way of adding event listeners, which you'll also find in the Dreamhouse demo app, because that's where I copied the code from when I needed it last time. If you put that on, if you put that on a component, right? Let's say it's a case, right? And then you open 3 cases at the same time in different tabs. They're all listening, and so that event will fire X number of times. So yeah, I found that to my cost. So in production code, that got tidied up so that the way I fixed it previously is you just put the record ID in so that it can be selective about the event that it's firing. Yeah, do you want to? Can you give that man a mic? Oh, he's coming up. You're like, yeah. I don't move. Chuck don't move.
How much more stuff do you want to get through before?
So.
Any reason why you're not using the utility bar that can be used across all the tabs that you have open?
I'm not familiar with that.
The console utility bar.
Don't run away. Come back and explain some more. Let that be a warning to all of you. No, so yeah.
So pretty much, instead of having to worry about the event being fired on all the single tabs, if you have a console app, you can have utility bar listening for as a utility background task, listening for that, and pretty much publishing your events to all your canvas or your other frames.
That sounds possible to me. I mean, like I say, I'm not a developer. I wouldn't insult professional developers in this room by saying I'm a developer. You're looking at it now. Not a developer. So Daniel. I think the point is that yeah, I mean we've got an eventing system between these 2 applications now, which is running in the browser, which is accessible via JavaScript. I think how you want to wire it up, and is there a better way? Yeah, I mean I think it seems quite powerful to me.
I would have a preference for doing it the way you did it with filtering it, because there's no guarantee you'll be in a console context. So it would be nice to have a solution that works in both places. That code still executes in a normal Lightning experience context? Yes. Oh, cool.
So you can use the utility bar anywhere, is what you're saying?
Yeah, you would have to make sure it's in all your apps, though. So it'd be kind of up to the admin. You'd have to it would be another thing you have to worry about with your admin to say, hey, admins, make sure this bar, this app is always available, or utility.
Is it mobile too?
Probably not mobile.
Okay.
Okay, so I like this is going well. Let me just set a couple of reminders, and let's get more into what you want to say about it. Is it going all right? Yeah, 6 out of 10, 5 out of 10.
You're cracking.
Yeah, you're having fun. So let's do a quick recap, because I've kind of shown you some of the stuff. There's a lot of moving parts here. I didn't even show you the web application. I don't really want to show you the web application, but I'm happy to if you want to see it. So this was the problem. Let's recap, right? We had a lot of data. Most of it was poor quality. There wasn't really any operational benefit to bringing it onto Salesforce. That's going in the data archive. Our agents and data stewards need to be able to see it and search it. Okay, let's just put together a very simple Node Express app. If you're a better developer than me, you could absolutely use whatever front-end framework you want. Super. Now, what about operational data? When we start archiving that back, we're going to use standard APIs in Salesforce. I really like using the bulk API almost as kind of a batch processing mechanism, right? You don't have to have 10 million rows coming out of Salesforce, but it does the job management for you. So that was my preference. So the ETL stuff all got done in Python by a guy who does Python. But then the last thing was, okay, how do we produce this seamless experience for our end users? And even though I ended up putting the standard web application with an OAuth flow in the page application, I should say, the kind of archive viewer, even though I put that in an iframe, now my preference would actually have been to actually just use Canvas everywhere. I mean, why wouldn't you? And then in terms of that hybrid model of you've got the related list, and then just making use of an overlay, I think that that's we were just looking to solve a problem fairly quickly, but I think that's something I kind of want to explore more in the future as well. because I've always been a big fan of Canvas. I don't think Canvas gets no love. So that's basically it. What did we end up doing? What we ended up doing was this. We made use of the big objects so that when the case was closed, an Apex trigger threw those records into the big object straight away. We're already pushing down on that consumption of records that we've got, right? Because we're eating up a lot of records. So we would throw that into the big object straight away, and then purge out the email messages. 3 months after case closed, the cases and the emails from the big object would go over to the data archive, and then the accounts would stay on Salesforce for the 7 years. That's how we approached it.
When you went into the big object, were you using batch Apex, batch scheduled Apex? What was the mechanism for that?
No, standard SOCL. So again, just as in the same way, you can write a standard SOCL record into the big object, just as you would. And remember, we're operating.
Right to it when you're archiving.
Yes. So when we're closing the case, what we've got is a trigger that's going to read the email messages. It's going to write those into the big object, and then it's going to delete the email messages, and that was fine. When you come to get the stuff out of the big objects, you want to delete them. There's a special method, delete immediate, I think, for whatever reason. I don't know quite what's behind that, but you would call that, and that basically it tells it to delete the records out of the big object. But again, because we're working at sort of this kind of record level transaction thing, the volumes were not huge. So this was a use case that used a big object, but not in the way that I think people would traditionally think of a big object. So that's where we were going with that.
When you, as far as that archiving, when you close that, when the case is closed, is that synchronous or asynchronous to do the write out? Like, sort of what's the performance for the users?
It wasn't, so we didn't have a lot of, we didn't have any trigger load on case, so it was not really an issue. Well, as yet. I mean, of course, that may corrode over time, and perhaps, if it is proving a problem, then you could go to a kind of a daily batch Apex, sort of batch job and crunch through it that way. Hello.
A few questions, hi. I have a few questions on why did you use big objects other than like using a custom object when you're querying everything like synchronously, not asynchronously? So, I mean, what advantage a big object would give?
So what I found was that I'm able to use a big object directly with standard SOCL, and given that I had, just email message, pretty simple, pretty static, it suited my need. My investigations led me to read about asynchronous Apex and this whole pattern that they have with big objects for sending a long-running query off to the big object in order to locate the data that you're interested in, that data set, and then you would give it a target custom object that it would put the data in. Those use cases seem to be more around sort of reporting or sort of historical trend reporting, that sort of stuff. And that really wasn't what we were looking to do here. We were just looking to offload from our standard object into something that was less costly.
Storage is the main reason. So yeah, and emails cost more than the 2K per record. Like accounts and contacts, et cetera, are just 2K a record, but emails are the actual size of the email. So if you look, I mean, I know our org email is the largest object, so I could see how that would quickly.
It just gets a bit crazy with emails as well, because if you're an aggrieved customer or a cautious customer, and you're going to send an email to the company, and you've got more than one email address, well, let's just put that in the CC, right? So you're not sending one email, that arrives in email to case and creates 2 cases plus 2 emails plus 2 auto replies. And we had about 17 different email addresses that people knew. So it got a bit crazy. So yeah, lots of data.
So just one more question is, can we...
a little closer to the mic, please.
Yeah. Can we use shield encryption for the fields, the data on big objects?
I don't think so. Yeah. So you can't use it for reporting, you can't use it for searching, you can't encrypt it. Remember, it's like the big object definition is just an abstraction over a web service to whatever it is, Apache HBase or whatever it is that they use. Yeah. So I think maybe in that example, that's where the use of external objects might come into play again in order to kind of try and address that in some way, but that would be a whole other ball of wax.
Thank you.
So right now your user interaction as far as your customers are via email. Do you have do you have a future where you're thinking that they might have a portal or some other way to get to this? And if so, how will this architecture impact that?
Portal as in
like
customers
so let's say
viewing
you
their
have
emails,
you have
or-
a community. So
Yeah.
let's say you make a customer community and you expose cases to your customers.
Let's throw Live Agent and
And-
SMS in there too, just for fun.
No problem.
What would the lift be, say, to expose all this stuff to a customer? So like if you want to you have a list of archived cases and some other things, and you want to give your customer a view of all the cases they've opened without, just not, or maybe even give them the ability to comment on cases, rather than you say, oh, you know what, we're going to save some space. We want to give a little more, make it easier for customers to interact with us. Let's give them a portal that they can log in and log. I mean, do you see that as being something in your future?
I think that's interesting. I'm going to use my get out of jail free card and say that contract ended, so I'm not with that customer anymore. But I think it's interesting because we don't. So this is something I didn't cover, right? So I think really what this goes to is record visibility, right? So any kind of external storage, whether it be big objects, whether it be Salesforce Connect with external objects, or my iframe, can't participate in sharing. And sharing is really powerful. Salesforce were really smart when they came up with that. So how do we deal with that? I think practically, the component could be loaded within the community. That's fine. How do we then put some straps around? Can they see the record? Now, the pattern that I used was that within the Apex controller, that's the big objects. But this pattern worked for both the big object and the external. So the external application, this is what this call is here. So the external application, because it was launched through Canvas, has an OAuth token, right? So it's able to establish a server-to-server connection between the Heroku Data Archive app and Salesforce. So it's using this hierarchical approach of can they see the parent record? So the pattern I'm using really is kind of owned by parent. And so you can enforce with an additional query before you return the data, are they allowed to see this data? But I think from a practical point of view, Canvas works in communities, and we could load that, right? It's on the public internet, so that's going to come up. What do you think, Carl?
Canvas, you're fine. Big objects in a customer community is problematic.
Doesn't work?
They don't have access to that.
Okay.
You got to pull it out and then give it back to them.
So there you go. Connected app. Any more? Was this too crazy?
I got a tough one for you then. Looking at, you have Salesforce, standard object, or custom object. You have big objects. You have external SQL Server, right? How did you ensure integrity of the email data, knowing that things come in plain text, things come in HTML, there's emojis, there's Unicode, there's a limit of 131,072 characters in a big object? How did you ensure that you had a valid email message that somebody could come back and look at 7 years later?
So email's horrible. So we had a number of issues with just the size of email bodies anyway, right? Especially when you get into replying. So even within standard email message, get into reply, and you get these big chains. So I think that's an issue. In terms of like Unicode, it's kind of all bets are off really. It's just however it comes out in this thing. I think that's another interesting one is, would you kind of go for an additional sort of JavaScript component that's able to do better rendering of that data? I think, that would sort of solve for that. But, we didn't get into that. We had a very immediate need, and what we were trying to head off was them using going directly to the email box, the Gmail email box, because that's a compliance issue. So, this is about as far as we got. So I think that's a good one to think about. I think probably it can be solved.
That contract ended, right?
What about attachments? Use the mic. Just stand up and use the mic if you don't mind, so it's recorded. And we're definitely open for general questions. Feel free to jump up and queue up behind a mic.
What about dealing with attachments?
Yeah. So we got the business to agree that we didn't have to deal with the attachments, that they would still be available in the email, within the email box. And if they needed to go
Dodged
get
a
it.
bullet there.
We dodged a bullet. Well, but this is where email is so problematic. So we had to get got them to agree. In order to deliver it on time, we had to, that they would have to go and get that as a separate request. So they would have to open an internal service case for a data steward to go get that for them. But I think, again, that's something that can be solved, with the use of, external, Google Drive, right? So they were a Google Apps user, so you could put those on Google Drive and off you go.
Attachments are the worst. Thanks for the talk. This was great. It's very timely for me and my team, actually, because if you replace your little data archive thingy at the bottom here with Google BigQuery, this is like part of what we're looking to do currently.
So I had that one too. I didn't get to solve that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and before my question, to kind of recap the general solution, it sounds like some event happens, and in this case, the case is closed. And then you move the data into a big object. You wait X period of time to then archive it. And then when that succeeds, remove it from the big object. So you can kind of keep...
Yeah, we would, I mean, it was, I think, again, it was kind of sort of time pressure that we were able to kind of offload into the big object fairly easily without having to, finish the project to do the data archive. And then by the time that was done, we could rationalize that.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
And so what I'm thinking about is, do you recall like the reasoning for that middle step? And I can think of some pros and cons for both sides of even introducing the big object piece of it altogether. I was just curious if you...
So it was kind of a sequencing thing where we wanted to offload that increasing pressure of storage as quickly as possible. The project to deliver the kind of the web application, and it was on AWS as it was in production, that was going to take a little bit longer. And so we could address that within the Salesforce team internally with the big object. And then we didn't undo that basically when we came to have the external archive.
Are you saying that if you were going to do it again net new, you wouldn't have that middle layer of big object, then deep storage? You go straight to deep storage?
I think, kind of looking back in retrospective, it feels a bit redundant these days, but it was really sort of just real world practical, project pressures, which is, okay, we've got Salesforce development resource available, admin resource essentially in me, but we need a developer. Developers aren't going to be available for 2 months, and then they can get into it. So it was just, that was the reason. But yeah, I think probably if I had it again, we would back that out, if I was still there.
Is the data archive was the piece that you showed where you just search for a case? Or was there an intermediate piece where it was still attached to the case?
So,
because the big object gave you the contextual information of, I can still see the emails and the pieces of information that relates to this case, because I thought when you went to archive, it was, well, just search for it. So you lost that context.
Right. So, see, I told you this was dense. So the reason this happened was...
It's just a reason to use the intermediate step of big object.
Yeah, so the simple answer is that this legacy data never got matched and put into the CRM because it was just too problematic in terms of quality, and the business value was limited. So that went directly into the archive, and that's what the viewer goes over.
What about the ongoing archive? Did you separate the link, or you kept the link?
No, so the ongoing archive, it follows that hierarchical path, right, where the account's going to stay on Salesforce for live customers, right? If somebody cancels, they're no longer a live customer from a Salesforce point of view, and the account can go to the data archive as well, and just, it's not going to be accessible then because we don't need it from a customer service point of view. The reason is, and I mentioned it at the front, the ERP system is the system of record for the customer master account, And that ended up actually being quite convenient, right? Because the ERP system, as far as we're concerned, has got endless storage. So that was problem solved for us, right? The ERP system still had its integrity because it's got everything it needs. We're not going to get any service calls because they're not a customer. Sorry, can't find you on the system. Are you a customer? No, I cancelled. That's why then. But should we need to follow the paper trail, the data steward can go into the data archive, start with the account, and then drill down through.
So you really you tiered it. Operational data,
Yeah.
recent operational
You've got all the
data
CTA language.
that you may need to access, and then essentially cold storage, it's there for
All right.
some reason.
So ask me the question again.
No.
No? Oh, okay. So the answer is we tiered the access to the data.
It would be a reason why you put the big object in there.
Yeah, is there ever a case where you need to go from that middle layer back to sales? So if I'm a user and accidentally close a case and I need to reopen it because I clicked the wrong button or something, like. It's
Your
a funny
fingers
scenario.
So-
if you do that.
In
I
our
think
case, it's someone
that's a
like,
training issue,
Yeah.
number one.
Oh.
What, Chuck? This is the real world. That's, that's a training issue.
That's a pro in having that middle layer because it's still really, it's not like
Yeah.
gone in the archive. Yeah.
So the thing I was going to say is that there was a business decision was taken around, if we receive an email from the same person with the same identifier, do we reopen a closed case? And we chose no because it was going to basically skew reporting. So there was a reporting requirement that net new emails coming in after a case closed was a new case, and then we would work out, well, was the case not resolved correctly? As for the accidental deletion, we didn't have an instance of that while I was there, but yeah, well, not deletion, it's accidental case closed. Yeah, I think that's a training issue. I'm not being funny. I mean, come on.
Thank you.
Contract's over.
I shouldn't have mentioned that, should I?
If there was a modal and then they confirm the delete, that's really on them. And
Yeah, you can
God
fix
forbid
it
you
with code.
design a reversal process.
So one question. So when an account, the account cancels, right? You move that to the archived?
Yeah, so there's just an additional table in the archive, but we didn't have any, we didn't need to visualize that within Salesforce. So that just gets ETL'd out, and then it can get removed from Salesforce.
So,
right?
so that customer is still in the ERP, but what if that customer comes back and reactivates the subscription again? So that's a new customer again in Salesforce?
So remember, the ERP system is the system of record for the account. So they would come in, they would sign up. The ERP system has a responsibility to match that against any previous account activity. I wasn't involved in that in terms of what's the business process there. Is it a new account on the ERP system? From our CRM point of view, I spoke at the top about like the churn that we would get, like trialists, would sign up and then they would cancel, then they would use a new email address because we wouldn't allow them to sign up with the same email address.
Correct.
So from a CRM point of view, that account would just get created based on the integration from the ERP system.
So even if the ERP does not create a new customer, it reuses the same one, but Salesforce, you will have a new account record per se. And you lose all that history because that account got into archive.
That's how it was. I mean, I think that in theory, you could say, well, look, we could reattach and merge, but again, it's kind of around business value. We didn't need to see, sort of multi-lifetime customer history. It's really just, from the point of view of, they've got an open case with us. Have we resolved that case? And then it's done and gone. And the archive really is there just as, from a compliance point of view.
Thank you.
I'm curious, so on the archive, you ended up with AWS as being the place that it gets stored?
So they were an AWS shop.
Okay.
They had a little bit of Heroku. They were moving off of that. They wanted to standardize. So that's
So
what they did.
I was going to ask, or what was there a process or the decision was just because they were an AWS shop? So, I mean, I was thinking because you could do Heroku and Heroku Connect would be another option. Like, did you look at that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's where the Heroku Connect and the Salesforce Connect that's Salesforce's
Cost-wise.
pattern for solving this problem. Yeah.
So it was cost. Was that you said, oh, that's too expensive to go that route, or?
So I think Salesforce Connect, we said no because we don't have any other compelling use cases where we could kind of make the value case. It was just going to take too long. The Heroku thing, they wanted to standardize on AWS, so that kind of limits our options there as well.
And Heroku Connect's expensive too.
Yeah. Look, it's all value. I think it's highly valuable. Yeah, I mean, it all costs money. I mean, writing this costs money. I mean, it's always those trade-offs, right? It's, okay, how many developer hours do we need to go put in this? What's the maintenance overhead going to be year on year for this as well? And at the end of the day, when you put the figures next to each other, Heroku Connect and Salesforce Connect is not outrageous. So.
And you can always negotiate down.
Hey.
Operators are standing by. Yes, sir.
So for the related list where you have the big object, you have the archive.
Yeah.
Right? I was seeing it was cut off, so we're using Visualforce at that point, right?
No, I think at some point, I played around a lot when I put this demo back together for the extracurricular.
I was curious if it was not resizing dynamically.
Yeah, no, I just, is this the big object one? I think it is, yeah.
That looks much better than before.
No, yeah, I just haven't formatted it properly. So I went and tidied back the other ones, but this one I haven't tidied it up.
With Lightning Web Components, it probably would be a good move.
Lightning Web Components solves everything, I agree. So, but yeah, I didn't do as good a job styling this as I did working around with the canvas, but I think Lightning Design System.
Did you hit a lot of roadblocks with having to do text for most of it, like date fields, or would they nitpick with message date? You have like the T format from Apex.
So yeah, I mean this needs additional formatting, but that kind of goes back to the big object data types that are available. You're much more restricted.
So that was a trade-off.
So that was a trade-off. So you would have to compensate for that with additional styling within your component markup, to tidy the data up and that kind of stuff. So this is where this is where custom objects are just a joy to use, really, aren't they? It does most of the work for you. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
You mentioned GDPR.
Yeah.
What was maybe this is too detailed a question, but what was the flow if somebody said, I want remove me? Was that factored in terms of it would flow from the ERP system down to the Salesforce CRM, or was that done manually into each systems by the data stewards?
So it's a bit of a nightmare, really.
You just described GDPR.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. And I kind of said that this is sort of the first major time I kind of came up against having to consider GDPR. And what it did for me is it made me much more aware of all of the copies of data and all of the systems. And, I think oftentimes within sort of the Salesforce world, all the buzzwords get banded around by marketing of, single customer view, implying that there's a single database with a single record for that customer. And that's absolutely not true. And I would spend most of my time in the architect role running around waving my hands in the air going, we're actually creating more copies of the customer than we had originally. So that's really where the role of the data steward, I think, is going to become more and more central, because they've essentially got to go to the relevant system owners. And I think this is where the importance of data governance, again, is amplified, which is, does every system have a nominated owner, somebody who is responsible for that system? Do they have procedures in place that they've provided in order to allow the data steward to access that data? I mean, I think that these processes have been more commonplace within regulated industries, like in pharma or something like that. But now that really applies across the board in terms of having a handle on where do we keep copies of customer data. And then, I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but the importance of having a data classification policy within the organization, right? That shouldn't be the role of developers or architects to write. That's absolutely not, that's not our job. There should be a data classification document which says, here are examples of particular data, and we classify it as sensitive, or we classify it as private. And then we did this exercise as part of this project, which is you then take that data classification document. You go then through your Salesforce schema, and it basically allows you to identify what are your sensitive items of data, and that can then be fed into the processes and procedures around subject access request and subject deletion request, which is essentially the sharp bits of GDPR. So that was a long answer.
You didn't build anything specific on Salesforce to handle those requests. Your data tools box took care of that. Is that right?
So we made use of individual object within Salesforce in order to kind of give us that handle on leads, accounts, contacts, that kind of stuff. But really, yeah, we didn't build that tooling on Salesforce. That was external.
So finding the email in the current case, the archive, and the big object, the external data tools box took care of that.
And yeah, and basically an operational procedure that says go and check these systems in turn and find the data that relates to the request. And if there's no data, you sign off and say there's no data.
A wrinkle with the GDPR stuff, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in it, is this idea of, well, I need to remember that I forgot you, but not keep personal information. So something like, well, hash a representation of a person so they can check if they've, because this whole idea of if you come back later, like, am I allowed to remember you? And you kind of need to know if you had forgotten them in the past,
Yeah.
but not keep any information.
So this is kind of getting a bit into sort of business decisions, but these are absolutely the decisions that the business needs to make, which is, are we allowed to keep that person's email address for 7 years? Well, if we have a good reason, yeah. I mean, is 7 years appropriate, or is it 3 years, or whatever it needs to be? So you are permitted to keep, if it's reasonable, you're permitted to keep that. So if we're saying, well, our business model is we don't want people repeatedly signing up with the same email address, and therefore we need to keep their email address, that's okay. Do we need to keep all of the previous correspondence if we didn't have a commercial relationship with them, for example? Perhaps not. So it's not like the rules are hard and fast. It's all about being proportional, being accountable, and being able to demonstrate that if you were asked by the regulator. Does that answer your question?
Consult your lawyer. That's what I'm saying.
Well, and the lawyers are the people that should be producing the data classification policy, and also a data retention and disposal policy, often called a data retention policy. But I think the way I always talk about it now, really as an outcome of this, is I always refer to it as the data retention and disposal policy to underline that point that this data needs to have a death date. And I think that's. I'm interested when I get my next project around, smarter ways to kind of identify, when are we going to delete this data? I think you could even have a custom field on pretty much everything that says this record is going to be deleted on date X unless something happens. But that's out of the scope. So.
By the way, good luck getting that an actual actionable answer from that legal team.
Yeah. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah. This is actually not a follow-up, but just kind of independent of designing and solutioning out this architecture, once it's built or mostly built, how did the team at the business go about testing and validating that handling all of this data is working correctly? And I know I've had issues where large amounts of data don't get mimicked correctly by test cases or whatever else.
Yeah, so, I mean, Cole kind of gave me a tricky question, which is, what about, email threads that are just too big? Yeah, unfortunately, they get truncated. But from a testing point of view, they made use of UI test automation tools to do the regression testing. And then in terms of, loading data into the archive, we were able to load test data, directly into the SQL databases and also into the big object. In order to allow us to test for that. So, that was within the Salesforce world in the big object, then that was, in the sandbox, and then, just a test database and test web app for the data archive. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
You sure?
No, I mean, that's good. Yeah.
Okay.
So following kind of on that theme, what happens when the admin goes and adds a new custom field tomorrow on these objects?
Right, so this is where email message is a really suitable candidate for this kind of archiving approach, because that doesn't change very much, right? So I think
case.
I think so case is not. You're absolutely right. So I'll take that on. Don't worry. So this is the other thing to bear in mind is how volatile is the schema, and how are you going to deal with that over time? So I think the simple answer for a case is it's now additional maintenance overhead. On the remote database in order to have a home for that field when it gets archived. So
is there admin accessibility in the code that puts it in the big object with custom metadata and dynamic queries, or how do you make that a livable solution?
So remember, the big object was just the email message, which is not going to change. But I think that for the email message, no, it would not be an admin accessible task. And I think again, this is something I've kind of like not wrestled with, but I have wrestled with it over the last couple of years, which is appreciating at enterprise scale. I mean, you talked about this in your talk earlier about Salesforce is not the only system in the landscape, right? We've got lots of systems, even in relatively small businesses now, and I think that causes problems around this idea of you've just got one skill set and one admin. I think within my experience in IT, that's always been the case of ideally we'd have one person who could do everything, and they would know everything and all problems could be solved easily, but that's just not the way it goes, unfortunately. And as we move to ever more distributed systems, I think it's going to be something that needs to be dealt with. So the one-word answer would be governance, wouldn't it?
So was the only purpose of the data archive GDPR compliance only, or were there any other business purposes?
So it really comes down to this. We didn't have enough space.
So
right?
it was space.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And email's particularly toxic in terms of generating lots of fairly useless data.
Okay, all right. So that was what I gathered from it. So it wasn't just GDPR for the preservation perspective, it was also just, so I guess if it was space, then why did they make the business case of why not just utilize their own internal email servers as a means of compliance? Because they have to go under the same requirements preservation. Why not just purge it from Salesforce after a couple of years, after it's not really useful?
So we were trying to tighten up on all of the internal procedures. So one of the decisions that was requested by InfoSec and Cyber was we need to sort of stop users having access to these group email boxes. So that was a primary compliance requirement. And then there needed to be, I guess probably I would describe it, structure in place in terms of what is our archiving policy. So making use of an external archive in order to fulfill that, something that could be governed and managed by a data steward. That was the approach that that we took. So it wasn't purely a technical decision. It was a balanced decision really around, well, it's not all going to fit in Salesforce. It's got to go somewhere. Where is that place going to be? And then are we going to treat data in a consistent fashion?
But the source of it was because it was out of a group email inbox. So from sort of the growth of the system of the data over the life of Salesforce. So this is email to case. So we had, I don't know, somewhere over about 12 or more email aliases that were wired up in email to case that related to a number of email addresses in Google. So that's, we just kind of wanted to say, well, that was in Salesforce. It was this account, it was this contact, it was this case, it was this email, but we can't keep it all in Salesforce. Let's put it in an external SQL database. So, but then so that was 7 years, but that had nothing to do with the GDPR aspect.
No, so that was the reason for that data retention period is business need, right? Okay. So again, that's in the data retention disposal document, which is what's the reason for why are you keeping this data for this period of time? It's business need based on the fact that we had a commercial relationship with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious, maybe kind of wrapping this up, is how well is this doing as far as saving space? Like, do you know what the org is sitting at in terms of number of records?
Don't.
Contract
ended. So we had to tackle this problem because we were, email case management was the first thing that we brought on, and this kind of crazy growth was going to be a real problem to us as we continue to work on the kind of the CRM and marketing aspects. So basically, Salesforce CRM was going to be used as the sort of central customer view. And then connected to Marketing Cloud. So we needed to get all of our customers into Salesforce as well. We needed to leave enough headroom for that. Doing the numbers, we were going to need to buy additional storage still. It was really just, can we make that be
it's just kind of one increment rather than, have to go crazy. And then, there's the other things that we haven't talked about yet, which is, trade-offs around system performance. So if we let lots of data languish on Salesforce, then we start having dashboards not load in, relate lists not load in, reports timing out, that kind of stuff. And, again, this was fairly early days in the life of this org. We wanted to try and kind of keep a handle on this as early as possible. So that was sort of the rationale around that.
Does anybody have a question they've been holding on to for 90 minutes? No? Exhausted? Good. Hope you learned a lot. Thank you all for coming. Big round of applause for Matt.
Thank you.
All right, get out of here.
Yeah.